you looking for clever methods to address complex problems? Do you need ways to make predictions, determine probability, or minimize risks? If you do, then you're in the right place. Welcome to our podcast that we call Smart Remarks, Howarth States. Now here are your hosts, Christian Smart and Doug Howarth.
Well, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world. Welcome to Smart Remarks, Howarth States. I'm Doug Howarth, and with me today is Dr. Christian Smart. Today we're going to talk about, among other things, cryptocurrencies, Monte and the Laffer curve. Christian, how are you today?
Doing well. How are you, Doug?
Good, thanks. Very, very good. I understand from talking to you that, you know, as good as your book is, there was a part that you kind of liked a lot that they left out, or at least a couple of parts. Maybe you could start us out by sharing what that would have been in your book that we won't see, that maybe is in your second book.
Yeah, so thanks, Doug. So I try to motivate the discussion with stories. I mean, it does hit on some technical topics, but I try to discuss it in a non-technical way. And so, my editor liked that for the most part. He calls the style engaging, but there were a few cases where he thought things were a little too far afield and he wanted them cut out. So one of those was a discussion about theory versus practice. The Prime Minister of Ireland once said, well, I can see it works in practice, but doesn't work in theory. And so, you know, because one of the things I talk about in my book is the divergence between theory and practice. So a lot of theoretical constructs, and you pointed some out in economics that don't always work so well in practice, like the supply curve. One of the things I talk about in my book about risk, you know, the subject of my book is risk, is about the way that risk is perceived is not the amount of risk that really is out there. So, for example, one of the constructs that's often discussed is that when you begin a project, risk is at its maximum. And then when the project's completed, it's zero. There's no risk. And there's kind of it's kind of slowly, so these little notional graphs kind of show the risk kind of slowly decreasing towards zero. The problem is that that's not the way that risk is really perceived or assessed in practice. People actually, when they start projects, risk is actually perceived as being very minimal. And only as the project goes along and the development begins, and then the project starts encountering problems, do they either discover that there is risks that they didn't really understand, or they really admit to risks that they potentially knew were there all along, but tried to, like an ostrich with his head in the sand, just tried to ignore. So, one of the stories I tell to try to motivate that is the story of the philosophers Plato and Diogenes. The philosophers lived. Ancient Greek philosophers lived a long time ago, 300, 400 BC time frame, and they were contemporaries of each other, and they were both philosophically students of Socrates in a sense. Plato being Socrates' closest disciple, but they diverged quite a bit. So Plato was very interested in theory, and two key ideas I think that really have affected the modern world. One was theory, and that's affected modern academics, which is its strong focus on theory and to the exclusion sometimes of practical applications.
Right.
And the other one is more of almost a religious type idea that the body and the spirit are separate, and the spirit is good and the body is evil, which has had a strong influence on Christianity. I won't really go over that anymore, but just I have heard people say that the modern church has been more influenced by Plato than Jesus.
Yeah.
For example. So, but anyway, so I won't belabor that point. But the idea between Plato and Diogenes, Plato talked about the theory of forms, and one of the ideals he talked about was cupness, the idea of cupness. And Diogenes attended his discussion on that subject, and he said he didn't understand the ideal of cupness. And Plato said, you don't have the head for understanding the discussion. And Plato went up and tapped Plato on the head, and he said, I think here's the emptiness that goes in the cup. It's up here in the head. So So that's kind of the the conflict between theory and practice. Sometimes theory is important, but it needs to be grounded in what's reality.
Yes, yeah. And when you're mentioning the risk and you're talking about birds, it reminded me of a project I studied just briefly for a thing we were looking at. There was a dredging operation going on in the Netherlands. They wanted to create more harbor space in a certain port. I think it was Rotterdam. And so they started digging, and they were looking for places to put the dirt. And as they started to put the dirt down, they ran afoul, no pun intended, of a bird that was nesting. That the government decided, well, the bird needs to have its nest, and therefore you will not be able to work in this area during the nesting period. And that happened for 3 or 4 seasons of a long project, adding on months and months of work to it. So there's lots of unseen risk that you don't allow for. And I know who saw that risk at the beginning of the dredging project, right? Absolutely.
Oh, right. Yep, definitely. Yep.
Yeah. So again, your book's coming out in
November. I'm currently in the copy editing phase. I just got the initial copy edits, responded to some questions, made a few changes. It's looking very good. So then there's a couple more rounds for the book, but it's getting close. So it's I did a webinar for ASEA that took place on June 23rd. And if you're interested in viewing that for the price of $25, if you're an ASEA member, which is International Cost Estimating and Analysis Association, or $50 if you're a non-member, you can view the video recording of the video at ASEAonline.com//QED, which stands for Quo Errata Demonstratum, which is how people used to always end a mathematical proof with. In Latin it means thus it has been demonstrated. So you can view that there, so that's one place where you can get it, and that's like a 45-minute, 50-minute summary of the contents of the book. You can also pre-order the book on Amazon.com. If you search for SMART and Project Risk Management, you'll be able to find it. It's the title is Solving for Project Risk Management: Understanding the Critical Role of Uncertainty in Project Management.
Well, very good. I'm pleased to announce I'm going to have a podcast also at ICEA on the 29th of this month. You can find it at the same site that Kristen's podcast is. And my podcast is entitled, or my seminar rather, is entitled A 3-Market 10-Dimensional Trade. And in it, I show how we take 3 related markets and compare what happens when one market depends on another, which depends on another. And it turns out that we can portray that in 10 mathematical dimensions. And that's part of what it is that our company does, is it created some ways to view added dimensions. And so this is an extension of that. So more about that later. So you and I had a few topics to talk about this week, and we were talking about Monte Hall and Let's Make a Deal last week, and I find that thing fascinating. I kind of like to return to that if we could for a few minutes, because that's a fascinating problem, not well understood, and we got into the Bayesian statistics, and Bayes is more prevalent. In fact, my 3-market 10-dimensional trade is basically a Bayesian thing across 3 markets. One depends on the other, depends on the other. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about the 3, I'd say the 3-card Monte, but it's really the 3-door Monte problem that we've had, right?
Yeah, Monte Hall. Last time we talked about this problem a little bit, and talked about the solution, and it confuses a lot of people. It's a little bit counterintuitive. Monte Hall was the host of the game show Let's Make a Deal. I think it's still on the air, but Monte Hall is no longer the host. I think he's passed away, but he used to be the host of the show back in the 1970s. And this is kind of an idealized form of a game that he played on his show, which was a contestant is presented with 3 doors. Behind one door is a car, and behind the other 2 doors is a goat. So there's 2 goats and 1 car. And if you choose a door at random, then what Monty Hall would do is he would open a door that you did not choose, and show you a goat, and then ask, would you like to switch? Now, the probability part of this is it in your favor? Should you switch doors when he shows you a goat? And and the answer is it is. It's not intuitive. It's a lot of people think, well, it's 50-50 either way, but it's not really true, because Monty is never going to open a door that shows you a car. So he's only going to open a door that shows you a goat, and that gives you additional information. So, but there's two assumptions in that. I've seen, if you're familiar with the Quora, there's an app and a website called Quora,
Yes.
Quora.
Mhm.
Some people argue about this a little bit in the sense that, well, you've got to assume a couple of things. So there are two key assumptions. One is that Monty knows all the information about the game. He knows which doors have the goats behind them and which door has the car behind it. And he's always benevolent in this sense that he's always going to open a door, regardless of what you do. He's not going to only open a door if you pick the door that has a car behind it, for example. He's not trying to get you. He's
Right.
trying to help you. So if the answer can change, if he doesn't know anything, then him just randomly opening a door and you see a goat doesn't change anything, doesn't improve your odds at all, because there's no additional information that you gain, because he doesn't have any information for you to gain from him. If he's malignant in the sense that, or malevolent, he's trying to get you, then he can try to rig it so that switching the door would actually go against your favor. But these two assumptions basically, it's always the case that you should switch. And one of the ways you could see it is if you were to repeat this experiment. Let's say you were to do this 90 times, right? So 30 times it would be behind door 1, 30 times behind door 2, and 30 times it would be behind door 3. And then, but if you let's say you pick door 1, this is a symmetric problem, so it doesn't matter. So if you pick door 1, then there's, half of the times there's, and so then what happens? So there's two stages of this game. You pick a door, 1, 2, or 3. Let's say you pick door number 1. And then after that, the next stage is Monty Hall opens, and let's say he opens door number 3, which has a goat behind it. So you play this game 90 times. You pick door number 1 every time, but 30 of those times the car is behind door number 1. So there's a 50-50 chance that that when he opens door number 3, that there's a car or a goat behind door number 1, because now you know that the car is not behind door number 3. But if it's really behind door number 2 and he shows you door number 3, then you know that you don't know this, but then there's a 100% chance that the car is behind door number 2. So he's not going to show you that door. So it turns out that if you were to do this experiment 90 times, in 30 cases, the where he shows you door number 3, in 30 of the cases, the car is going to be behind door number 2, and the cases that are relevant to you in terms of getting the car, and in half of those, the car will be behind door number 1. So it's always in your favor to switch. You gain information from being able to switch. So that's kind of, we talked about this some last time, but just a little bit more. It's always an interesting problem.
I kind of get at the problem the other way, which is you start out that there's 3 doors, so there's 100% probability it's behind one of the 3 doors. But Monty's getting 2 of the doors. That means his odds are 67% that he's got the right door, and you're getting 1 door, so your odds 33%. So when Monty opens one of the other doors, your odds haven't changed. You still got the one of the 3 doors with which you started, which means that the remaining probability is 67%. That's pretty good. So
yeah, that's a good way to think about it too. Yep.
Very interesting. So that kind of gets into the whole idea of money, and you brought up that you were interested in Bitcoin. Now, I've studied Bitcoin a little bit, and some people, I know several of my friends, consider cryptocurrencies to be investments. But to date, we have people that trade on currency exchanges, and if you study currency as I have, you can figure out that what holds up a currency primarily in the United States, there's two big factors that drive the value of the currency. One is how much have you printed of it, and then then how much foreign reserves do you have to back that up? And if you take those two things, those two attributes together, you can kind of get a reasonably good estimate of what the currency is worth.
Right.
So what's interesting to me is that there's no counterpart to foreign currency reserves for any of the cryptocurrencies outside of the ones that are tied to currencies, fiat currencies. So I guess my first question to you would be, is Bitcoin only a currency, or is it a currency and an investment? And if it's an investment, is it an investment simply because you got in early and you got in on the low supply, or is it an investment 5 years down the road if you're just coming into it?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know. I'm still trying to wrap my head around digital currencies. In the past, currencies were backed by some sort of, paper currencies were backed by something like gold or silver to some extent. And then government switched to fiat currencies where they said this has value because we say it does. In the digital currency, what is holding up the value? Is there something backing it that provides it with value, or is it an alternative? Is it some sort of secure form of currency that can't be hacked, like a bank account can? I guess that's one aspect to it. Does it have value because it is secure? I guess there's some value in the security of the currency.
Yeah, I mean, they of course have all the cryptocurrencies are built on blockchain, so they would argue that there's a digital record and therefore it's secure in that way. But what's fascinating to me too, and I seldom hear proponents of cryptocurrencies talk about this particular facet of the currencies, but the currencies that you buy have value to the extent you can prove you have a record of them. And so what happens to a lot of people is that they lose their records. They put the account on you and I are both working off of a laptop here. They put the account on a laptop, they get a new computer, and for some reason they forget to transfer all the data from one computer to the other, and they've lost their path back to their cryptocurrency. Now you'd think, well, that's got to be a minuscule problem, but it turns out that there's some high fraction of especially Bitcoin, the most expensive one that's out there. There's a high fraction of Bitcoin that's lost due to those kind of happenings. I think it's north of 10%.
Yeah, there's actually an episode of The Big Bang Theory where the Big Bang guys, they've earned. I guess early in the days you could earn Bitcoin by solving mathematical problems.
Yeah, they call it mining.
Mining, yeah. So they mine some Bitcoin and they put it on a flash drive,
right?
And then they couldn't find the flash drive because they read, oh, the value of Bitcoin's way up. Well, where's that flash drive? And they couldn't find it.
Yeah, well, that's a key issue, isn't it? I mean,
yeah.
Now, and of course, the one of the things that I saw with respect to currencies in general is that their value goes up to the extent that they're accepted worldwide. So, the US dollar is accepted worldwide, and that's part of what keeps it up. And most of these other currencies, cryptocurrencies, start out very local, and the value is set because it's a small network. But when an outfit like Facebook comes along, proposes, what was it, Libra? Was that their cryptocurrency?
Oh, yeah.
I mean, now that could be very unsettling to governments.
Yes.
All of a sudden, taking all the money from the government and it's somehow funneled over to a private entity. I just can't imagine governments letting that happen.
Yeah, that's what it's when corporations control the government. That's fascism, right? So is that
right?
Could that lead to a fascist state? I don't know. It's an interesting idea. I read a couple of books that relate to this topic recently. One is called Cryptonomicon by Neil Stephenson. It won an award for best science fiction book of the year in 2000. It discusses cryptocurrencies. Basically, it kind of talks about the idea of them about these guys found a lot of gold from World War II in the Philippines and were setting up a digital haven, and and they never did really. The novel doesn't end with them actually setting up a digital currency, but they talk about it in the book. So he's seen as someone like the prophet of the advent of cryptocurrencies. Mm-hmm. And that book originally came out in 1999, and it wasn't until 9 years later that Satoshi Nakamoto published the first white paper on Bitcoin. And he's a shadowy figure. No one really knows his true identity.
That might not actually be just one person. It might be several people too, right?
It can be several people. It's been speculated that Neil Stephenson's actually Satoshi Nakamoto.
Oh, that's interesting.
Because his Satoshi Nakamoto's initials are SN, which is Neil Stephenson NS reversed.
Okay.
So there's some talk about that, and I guess at one point that individual or group of individuals was worth some $50 billion at the peak of the Bitcoin craze.
Oh, geez.
And that's another subject that was in the book, Narrative Economics by Robert Shiller, a Nobel Prize winning economist, who talks about narrative economics and how that some narratives like Bitcoin spread like viruses. They're like epidemics.
Sure.
And you can see how fast, for example, COVID has spread, now spreading again. And similar things like narratives like Bitcoin, one of the narratives in that was people wanted to be part of it. It was futuristic. People wanted to be part of this future wave. And that was one of the narrative threads that drove the popularity of Bitcoin. And another one that Shiller talks about in his book is the Laffer curve, which you've done some work on.
Yes. Interestingly, we had studied the marijuana market a little bit several years ago, and I got to thinking, as more and more data started to pour in, as more states started to legalize marijuana, that if I took all of the tax and revenue data from the states and then normalized it to a certain year, so I think I normalized it to 2019, that at the limit, we like to talk about frontiers a lot in our field. What we call typically a demand frontier would appear. Well, what we wanted to see is if at a limit, again, the Laffer curve for the uninitiated, Laffer curve looks at it typically, well, in our vernacular, I think Laffer actually had it rotated, but the way we show it is we have the tax rate on the horizontal axis. So it starts at 0 at the origin, moves rightward, and in this case, it actually goes past 100%. Laffer himself had said that he thought that, if you applied it to income tax, you started at 0, you'd have 0 revenue. You go all the way to 100, you have 0 revenue, but somewhere in between, there's a peak described by a second-order polynomial that you could work out the maximum, just doing a little differentiation. But I got to thinking, well, what would happen in marijuana? What is that going to form a Laffer curve? So I started to pick up data from Washington and Colorado back in 2014, when recreational marijuana became legal in those two states. And I took their revenue, and then I divided it into the revenue per capita per capita marijuana user in the state, because there's data on that too. And then I started adding in the other states that started to have receipts, including California, Massachusetts, and then last year, most notably Nevada. It worked out that at the limit, Nevada was getting something on the order of $800 per marijuana user per year. And Washington State in 2014, it was down around $50. Now, what was interesting on this curve is that the high point with Nevada was that they only had a tax rate of about 15.5%. Whereas if you went all the way down to the other end of the curve, Washington State in 2014 had an effective rate of 108%. And so along this frontier, which was statistically significant, along this frontier, that's basically telling you, as you go horizontally, again, that's the tax rate, and you go vertically, that's the amount of per capita money you get per user. That really becomes the efficient frontier for the government in terms of taxation. What's the most money, other way to cynically do that, what's the most money I can wring from the cannabis users, given my tax rate per capita? And if you're not on that curve and you're in the market, but you're not on the curve, what you've got then is you've got an inefficiency. You haven't made your markets efficient enough so that you can get to that limit. So here in California, we had in 2019, we have 13 times the population of Nevada. But at the end of 2019, Nevada made twice as much revenue as California with 1/13 the population. And so Nevada is actually defining that frontier, along with Washington State in 2014. That's the worst you could do. And along this curve, there's some other points, Colorado and another version of Washington in a different year. So California is both inefficient with respect to how much they're extracting at the tax rate, and they're also taxed too high. So if they were to drop their tax rate, the revenue would go up. Now, what would happen to Nevada's revenue at the same time? Well, it's probably the case that, if you take the tax rate of Nevada at I think 15%, and you take the amount that they've been taxed, $800, it's basically saying that the average marijuana user was spending $4,800 on marijuana. Or some people came into the state and bought it and they took it out, right?
Yep.
And some of those people might have been from their neighbors, which is, of course, us, which is up here, so us in California. So the observation of this is that if you're a state that's in a financial fix, and which states aren't right now with COVID, and you want to try to extract more money from your tax base, the last thing you want to do is inefficiently tax people. So if you tax too high, and there's an alternative to go to some other place, you can lose that revenue. So here in this state, what happens on a more long-standing basis and always legal basis is that the state gas taxes here are higher than Arizona. And so if you find yourself in California driving to the Grand Canyon, what you want to do is you want to make sure that you don't buy gas, as you hit the eastern border of California. You want to get into you want to get into Arizona because you're going to save money. Well,
Right.
This gets back into the whole idea of incentives in economics. People don't want to pay for, the marijuana, and the gas isn't any better in California than it is in Arizona or Nevada, respectively. So what you want to do is you want to observe what's going on and make some sense of it and start to tax accordingly. I don't know if you remember, this happened out your way. Might have been 10 years ago. Remember the big gas tax scam that there was, where people were transporting tankers of gas from one state to another to avoid the taxes on it? You remember that?
Yep.
It seems ludicrous that with all this knowledge that we have, that we can't make these things uniform across, say, something like the whole United States. That would be really swell,
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Definitely. Yep.
So.
Yep. It's interesting. Arthur Laffer actually lives. I live near Nashville, Tennessee, and Arthur Laffer lives in Tennessee. Tennessee has no state income tax, which I think is one reason why he moved here. He's a big anti-tax guy, as you can imagine.
Mm-hmm.
He at one point when he first moved to Tennessee, it was reported that he said that Nashville was a great state to live in, but not a great state to die in, because state taxes were fairly high, and then they cut the state taxes. So now he decided he's going to stay because it's a great state to die in as well, because his personal wealth won't be taken away from him when when he dies, so his descendants can get more of it, I guess. So,
Yeah.
So now he says it's a great state to die in as well. But it was interesting. One of the things that Schiller talks about, I guess I didn't appreciate, was, there's 2 points on the curve that yield the same amount of revenue. One is lower tax and one is higher tax. So you can, try about lowering taxes, you could potentially achieve the same amount of revenue or more than at a higher tax rate.
Yeah, and the one thing that people fail to appreciate when you do the lower taxes is they'll look at a stagnant condition. They won't look that it might draw more people into the particular state, too.
Right.
Just like Laffer left. He used to teach here at USC, so he left California to move to Tennessee to avoid taxes.
Right.
So I think you said you actually saw a little bit of history from Dr. Laffer at the Smithsonian, didn't you?
Yeah, so back in February, my last business trip that I went on so far, I've been kind of shut down with the pandemic on business travel, but I was in the DC area, and I was in Arlington, Virginia for a conference. I was actually presenting uh, a summary of my book, an earlier version of my book that was focused on aerospace and defense at the Military Operations Research Society gathering that they had at the end of February. And I got on the metro, took the metro across to the Smithsonian. A lot of people that were there. It's been a while since I've been in a crowd that big. And in the American history, they have a section on business, and they have like the Bloomberg terminal, Michael Bloomberg, and
Sure.
and then they have a small section about other economics related items. One is Milton Friedman's briefcase. One of the
Wow.
briefcases he used, this big black briefcase,
No free lunch in
and one of
there.
those is there. Huh?
No free lunch in there, right?
No free lunch in there. No free lunch. That's one of the things in my book I cite is Milton Friedman's no free lunch. And another a pin from or something about Ross Perot about the talking about debt. Talking about the importance of debt and the issues with debt. Ross Perot ran for president in the '90s a couple of times. Actually, did very well for a third party candidate. I think in '92 he got about 18% of the vote, something like that.
Yeah, right.
And he did very well as in as a third party candidate. And but anyway, he one of the things that he was talking about was the amount of debt that we had, and debt was an issue. And one of his critiques of President George H.W. Bush was an increase in the deficit. Reagan also increased the deficit significantly, and so he had some memorabilia about his focus on debt. And then there's also the Laffer curve, which supposedly was there was Laffer was at a restaurant with I think Don Rumsfeld, and there was a Wall Street Journal columnist that was there, Don Rumsfeld, and some other folks who worked for the Ford administration. He sketched out the graph on a napkin at the at the luncheon when they're having lunch at I think the Four Seasons restaurant in DC, and he's kind of sketched it out, and then that was then later given to the Smithsonian and it's immortalized there. The only thing and so that makes it a very popular narrative, and it probably helped with its popularity. But it's actually believed that that little piece of memorabilia was actually forged, if you will, by the Wall Street Journal guy that was there, Jude Winniski, who since passed away. He is credited with actually having created the napkin after the fact and then inventing the story about the creation of the Laffer curve. Makes for a great story.
That is funny. Yeah.
It probably didn't actually happen. They probably talked about it, but they didn't actually have the piece of, didn't actually draw on the napkin.
Yeah. For those of you that aren't in aerospace or don't know too much about it, there's historically a whole bunch of things that have been sketched out on the proverbial back of an envelope or the back of the napkin. And, that it would just be the epitome of something like that. Kelly Johnson did the same thing with some of his fighters. He worked out some fighters in the 40s, just basically drew up cartoons on an envelope and handed it to the Army Air Force, and they came up with the P-38. That's how they came about with that. Is Kelly just whipped it out in a few minutes and came up with sketches and found a way to go and drove down the path, and then we had a plane. So.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah, it is. It's very amazing. So it'd be interesting. I'd like to be able to run the Laffer curve worldwide, but of course you need to have all the data from all the taxing states that are out there. But there's probably a way to optimize this. I mean, remember the Beatles wrote Taxman? You remember that song?
Yeah.
Let me tell you how it will be. There's one for you, 19 for me.
Yeah.
If 5% appear too small, be thankful I don't take it all.
Yeah.
Well, the Beatles moved themselves to Monte Carlo because of that. Have you been to Monte Carlo before?
I have not.
Monte Carlo's a little bit like Disneyland, except they clean Disneyland twice a day, and they clean Monte Carlo 4 or 5 times a day.
Oh, wow.
It's less than the size of the LA airport, very small country, but it's a tax haven. and they make all their money on the value-added tax, and they don't have an income tax. But you get lots of wealthy people paying the same flat tax for things that they buy. The next thing you know, well, you've got a whole bunch of money. Now, of course, they don't have a standing army or an air force or navy to pay for either, like we do. But
Right.
it just illustrates the point that if you drop taxes low enough, you're going to draw people to you, wealthy people, and that's something that you want to be able to do. And I think we've kind of lost sight of that with our taxation structure. We've got people moving in and out of jurisdictions because of taxes.
Right.
We need not do that if we were smart about it. So you also wanted to talk today, Christian. I know you've been studying, as I have, COVID, and you had something to say about COVID in Florida. So,
Well, one of the interesting things about I know that there's a narrative that the cases are increasing, but that's because testing is increasing. But cases are increasing faster than tests are increasing, and you can also see that in the increase in the number of hospitalizations and the increase in what you're not seeing nationally yet is an increase in the number of deaths, but deaths are a lagging indicator, so it could it could come along. It could also, and the good thing about it is that I think we understand, especially the medical profession understands a lot more about the virus than they did originally, and they have started come up with some things that help with some of the more difficult cases and more severe cases, including the use of steroids, which helps. But deaths are lagging, so we could see an increase in deaths. Florida has really been on fire lately, and that it's a little disturbing because people are still going on vacation there, so they may be going there, contracting the disease, not realizing that they have it for a few days, go home, and then spread it other places. There was a record over 10,000 cases today. At the height of the epidemic in New York, there was only 11,600 cases in one day. So we're getting close to that area. And Florida is accelerating. That was kind of when things were peaking in New York. On the other hand, we're just not seeing the number of deaths, which is a good thing. We're not seeing the number of deaths in Florida that we've seen in New York. In New York, people were dying at the rate of 1,000 people a day at one point.
Wow. Yeah.
So we're not seeing that many deaths in Florida. Hopefully that'll stay that way, but it's definitely a concern.
Here in California, I just studied the data on this, is that we hit about 3,000 cases a day in April, and it was pretty much flat, and then had a gradual decrease to the middle of June, and that's about the time we opened up the state. Yep. And we went from 3,000 to, as of yesterday, over 5,000.
Wow.
So we've gone up, over 2/3 by in the last 2 weeks. So that's very troubling.
Yep. So we're seeing a big increase here in Tennessee too. Yep.
So, I mean, we've just been banned. We, United States, Americans have been banned from Europe. I don't know if you saw that.
Yep.
And if you, Christian, decided you in Tennessee want to take a trip to New York, right now, New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut have a 14-day quarantine on people that comes in from high case states. So if you were to come in from Florida, they'd want to quarantine you.
Tennessee, Alabama, Georgia, Florida had to be in quarantine for 14 days, which would basically you would go, you get there. I guess you would be in a hotel for a little while, and then you'd come home. So you not much point in going there. That was one of the bad things about this. My family had planned to go on a cruise out of New York. It's a fall foliage cruise that would go up the East Coast, go out of New York and go up the East Coast and into Canada to see the fall foliage. But of course, that's been canceled, so it's unfortunate.
Oh, that would have been a nice trip. Wow.
Yep.
How far north would you have gone?
Nova Scotia. I think it's Nova Scotia. That's where it would go. It would stop in Massachusetts near Boston, the Boston area, and then go up to Maine, and then go up to Nova Scotia, and then come back down.
Interesting. Nova Scotia is a pretty place. Highest tides in the world, Bay of Fundy.
It's the highest what?
Highest tides, ocean tides.
Oh, highest ocean tides. Oh, okay. That's interesting.
They go up and down 40 feet in a day.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, they spend a lot of money on, and so it's probably a good source of hydroelectric power. I think when the I think there's one of the projects in that area. I think I talk about in my book. It's a project that experienced a lot of cost and schedule growth.
Yeah, they're trying to catch the tidal forces in and out of these channels, right? Where they get
Right.
all through there, and they try to create a turbine of some sort that flips with the tides.
Yep. It's very expensive. Yeah, these kinds of projects are very complex.
Yeah, it's amazing how deep, how much this risk phenomena can extend into all these different facets. So one of the things I think is kind of fascinating, you kind of touched on. In fact, the cover of your book shows a bridge going, approaching the perspective of the viewer there. It'd be interesting to see how we could place risk on the infrastructure that we have, the risk of keeping it versus the risk of letting it maybe crumble into nothingness. So, for example, we had talked a few weeks ago about Fukushima, and they built Fukushima with the idea that it gets back to your idea of probability versus consequence. So the probability of something breaching the seawall was considered very minuscule, but the consequence of something happening like that was, of course, catastrophic. And of course, they built a seawall to maybe withstand what they envisioned to be a 1,000-year wave. And for lack of a better term, they got a 2,000-year wave in there. And the rest is history. So as we see, like the I-35 bridge collapsing in Minneapolis, and we have this really low grade on infrastructure right now in the United States, how would you take your approach to putting a capital value on the infrastructure we have with a view to swapping it out for something new, basically to reinvigorate our infrastructure?
Yeah, that would be probably a good case of cost benefit analysis. And having to take the risks into account as well, and looking at, some of those extremes that occur. What are some of those extremes, and what is the likelihood of occurrence? Like, for example, in the when was that earthquake in San Francisco that caused that? There's that double-decker bridge in San Francisco.
Prima Loma, I think that was the quake. It was,
and it kind of collapsed on top of it.
Yeah, in the '89 World Series. Yeah.
Yeah, '89. Right. Yeah. What are those risks? How likely are they to occur? Earthquakes are hard to predict. Natural disasters are hard to predict, but they have they're known as fat tail phenomenon. So that's something that needs to be taken into account. The normal distribution when it comes to things like that is not so normal. I saw something the other day that Nassim Taleb, who's a big proponent of fat tail distributions, you think the normal distribution would apply in most situations. It does apply to things that are governed by the laws of physics to a large extent, like heights, weights, lifespans of humans. But if you start looking at the list of things that it doesn't apply to, it quickly becomes a much larger list. Frequencies of words, the sizes of cities, the sizes of firms, stock market fluctuations, all those things are much fatter tail. The cost and schedule of any kind of project you think about, of any complexity, they're all fatter tail than normal.
Getting back to infrastructure, suppose that you, instead of looking at a non-physical phenomenon, you looked at a physical phenomenon, say, for example, corrosion on a bridge. That ought to be able to be measured in a way in which you get useful predictions out of it. So, for example, you take the Minneapolis I-35 bridge going down.
Right.
It seems to me that somebody ought to have been able to predict that you had metal fatigue. But my understanding was that they weren't even doing inspections on these bridges. And that's part of what it is. Yeah,
that's part of the problem. They have to start doing some amount of upkeep and maintenance, and at least measuring what's going on.
So getting back to your cost benefit and also the risk. I mean, so you could assign, say this is pre-I-35 bridge going down, and all of a sudden somebody sees the metal fatigue on it because they have been studying it, and you say, well, the probability of this bridge going down is, just pick a number, 1 in 10 in the next 10 years.
Right.
Then you say, okay, well, that's you've been given a likelihood. What's the consequence of that happening? And so you'd say, well, there's going to be a certain number of people who are going to be on a bridge at a certain point in time. And then
Right.
once the bridge collapses, there's going to be, the attendant people that have been hurt or worse. But then you have to clear it up, and then you got to build a new bridge. And in the meantime, you've lost all this productivity that you were gaining because you had the bridge in the first place. Now people have to take the long way to get around to their
Right. That's another consequence. Yeah.
Yeah. So how would you? I have an idea how I would model that. What would you do for your models? What would you do?
You would need to look at it probabilistically and look at the probability distributions that would measure the likelihood and the consequence of these things occurring, and do some sort of simulation to look at what would happen and what the outcomes are.
So you give yourself a probability of the bridge collapsing, and suppose the collapse. Now you're into consequences, and so there would be, say, pick a number, 100,000 cars going over the bridge every day.
Right.
And those people are going to work and other things, and all of a sudden now they're rerouted and they have to go another, I don't know, pick a number, hour to get back to work. And so they've lost all those car hour days.
Right.
Plus you have to build a new bridge in a zone that's been compromised. It means you have to pull out the debris that's in your way that you haven't deconstructed properly. So that's going to cost you more money.
Yep.
And you've got to put up the new bridge, and you have to do all the stuff that's attendant to that. So that can be quite a process then in that case.
Yep. Yeah, it can be very, very complex.
Interesting.
But that's the kind of analysis that needs to be done, because it's a complex analysis. It's going to require some investment, but the return is so much greater than the amount of investment you have to make on something like that.
Right. So let's talk about the likelihood and consequence of the NFL being canceled this year. You said you wrote me a little note the other day. So Dr. Fauci might call off the NFL season this year, and I've noticed that a bunch of people in these, what they call them, bubbles or zones where they're supposed to be corona free, that they're starting to get, including your beloved University of Alabama, they're starting to get many more infections than they thought they would get. Right? I mean, what's the status on that?
Yes, I don't know the status of the football team right now, but I know at least 5 football players at the University of Alabama were diagnosed with COVID. So I don't think there's two aspects to that. One is fans in the stands, so that's probably pretty much out. Major League Baseball is trying to have a season with no fans in the stands. If you want to have a likeness of yourself at a game for $99, you can pay to have them make a cardboard cutout of a photograph of you and put it in the stands. But so that's one aspect. So there's no fans in the stands. That eliminates one source of risk. But the other source of risk is you have people, all these players around each other, training, exercising, showering, cleaning up, and apparently, when you exercise, the main way I guess COVID is transmitted is through respiratory droplets. So when you're exercising, you're breathing more heavily, you're excreting more respiratory droplets, so it's more likely to spread it. So, people on these sports teams are now testing positive as well. Mm-hmm. So I just don't see how they're going to be able to maintain a season. Major League Baseball wants to have a 60-game season. I just don't think that's going to see how it's going to happen. I mean, they could try it, but they're probably going to be shut down if it happens.
Interestingly, I watched a little bit of the English Premier League. That's soccer for us in the United States, and they restarted. And they don't have fans in the stands, but back to your point, they kind of have pictures of people in the stands at a certain place. But the one thing that they decided to do to make it more realistic is they're starting to pump in sounds into the stadium as if the crowd were there.
Ah.
And so what's fascinating to me is you've got two teams, and of course you got teams from both sides. So somebody will take a shot and it'll go awry. So if it's a home team, there kind of be a gasp from the crowd. But if it's two teams playing in the same city, like what they call derbies in England, they'll have a groan from one side and cheers from the other. And they've got some guy or some series of people on a big soundboard mixing up all the sounds of the crowd at the same time. So it's life imitating life effectively right there. We're trying to we had a certain reaction to things before. We recorded it. We have some new phenomenon to which we ought to react. We're not there, so we're going to simulate the reaction by inserting this newfound technology there. It's pretty fascinating.
Yeah, it's interesting. They tried to do some sort of tennis tournament. Novak Djokovic had some sort of informal tennis network, with some sort of tennis tournament that Djokovic had put together. He's one of the top tennis players, and he and his wife have tested positive for COVID now.
Oh, geez, wow.
So and some other people have too. So they had to shut that down. So they may not be in tennis a while. Where I used to live, Huntsville, they have a pretty big group of pretty active network of folks that play league tennis. Sometimes called club tennis. And they've had a little mini outbreak there as well. Even though it's outdoors, people are trying to, so it's told to stay away from each other. But you might have 100 people out there, and there's like 25 courts or more, and so any time you might have 100 people out there or more. So it's just inevitable that someone's going to come in contact with it. The other troubling trend, in addition to sports, is that a lot of young people in the state of Alabama, this recent news, that they're having these parties where they're trying to see who can contact COVID first, and they're actually putting money into a pot, and the person who contracts COVID first wins the pot of money.
Oh, geez.
It's pretty dumb, yeah.
That's an unintended consequence. Out here in California, we have lots of prisons, and the prisons are overcrowded. And so what happened was the governor said, well, I'm going to release prisoners that are low risk to get the population down, especially if, then they a little paragraph here, especially if they have COVID, right? So what started to happen? Well, there's a video out here where somebody had a COVID infected mask from somebody that got it, and they're all these inmates are passing the mask around, all sniffing down the mask.
Oh, so they can get out of prison.
They can get out of prison, yeah.
Oh, wow.
So it's hard to figure out how to incentivize people in such strange times. It's really kind of remarkably interesting to me.
That is definitely different. But you haven't had that here in Tennessee. That was one area where when they had a prison outbreak, that's not good. They have a prison outbreak, but it is not as troubling to me because I'm not visiting a prison or going to prison. Hopefully, not going to prison anytime soon. So, Doug, you have a book that you've been working on for a while and working getting published. So, I think that has something to do with the movement in space and things like that. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, when we're talking here about COVID, what we've got people that have a certain latitude, longitude, and altitude relative to other people. And what's fascinating about COVID is a disease that's passed on through particles, and those particles also have points in space, and your likelihood of getting the disease is a function of your proximity. In other words, there's a position for you, and there's a position for the virus. And what you want to do is you want to separate yourself from the virus. So my book looks at position it starts out in very simply with looking at three-dimensional maps. So it starts out with Hansel and Gretel. And when Hansel drops a rock to form the trail that he's going to have to take him into the woods when his parents are going to leave him there to die, why he comes back, I don't know. But when he's leaving these rocks, he's basically saying, I was here. Here's my latitude, here's my longitude, here's my altitude. He's leaving himself, he's created himself a trail that he can follow. And so the key concept in our view of the market is that every time you make a purchase, you are adding to the collective description of we were here. You go out and buy an electric car, you buy the first Mitsubishi i-MiEV in 2009. You're forming a point there that says, I bought one vehicle. I bought the first vehicle. It's worth $30,000. This forms the first purchase in the market. And as you start to buy more of them, say at the same price for the first year, you're starting to move that point laterally to a point that'll finally read the quantity and price for a certain product in a year. And then as other products start to enter the market, shapes form. And what math is, I think if you and I could agree on anything, was that math is pattern recognition. I mean, that's how the calculus was studied. There was a pattern recognition of that. And what this analysis is of ours, and so my book is entitled Unlocking Hidden Dimensions. The hidden dimensions are the ones that you can't see that actually describe what something's worth. And then we compare that to the demand for a product, what we call value. So we have value space as compared to demand. And that's what Unlocking Hidden Dimensions, my book, is addressing. So looking to try to get a publisher sometime soon. I need to rewrite another chapter because we've done more work. Well, we actually discovered that the four-dimensional system worked for COVID analysis.
Oh yeah, that'd be good. Yeah, that'd be a good chapter.
And since I started writing the book, we came up with the idea that the frontier describes the Laffer curve for marijuana. So there's other elements that the world just keeps dropping into our lap here, as it were, that we want to keep trying to. But at a certain point, as they say in aerospace, it's time to kill the engineers and build a product. So I need to stop engineering it and start to product here. So.
Smart Remarks, Howarth States has been brought to you by Multi-Dimensional Economic Evaluators. If you have any questions or comments, please email us at info@meevaluators.com. For more information on Christian, please visit his website, christianbsmart.com. And for more information on Doug, see his LinkedIn page, Douglas Howarth, or his website, doughowarth.com. Thanks for listening, and until next time, keep reaching for the right answers.